A visible cut line runs across the back of a marble head in the Cleveland Museum of Art. Officially, it is Emperor Vespasian, but the stone began as Nero. After Nero's death in 68 CE, Roman sculptors transformed some of his portraits into new emperors instead of replacing them. Today, 189 recarved male imperial portraits are known from the first 3 centuries of Roman rule, and Nero appears more often than any other ruler beneath a later face. Marble was valuable. Political loyalty demanded change, and workshops could update an image faster than they could produce a new one. Yet, more than half of the assessable portraits were altered most heavily where an audience was expected to look. If Nero was meant to disappear, why was so much of him left behind? The Cleveland head is only 40 centimeters tall. It is not a colossal monument towering over a forum or a shattered statue recovered beneath a palace floor. It is a human-sized fragment measuring 40 by 21.6 by 24.9 centimeters, preserved under accession number 1-929.998. The museum identifies it as Portrait Head of Emperor Vespasian, recut from a head of Nero, and dates the marble to between 64 and 79 CE. From the front, the transformation appears successful. Vespasian came to power after Nero's fall and the violence of the Year of the Four Emperors. The face now belongs to the new political order, but the image separates from itself when the head is viewed from behind. A line across the back marks the point where Nero's longer hairstyle was shortened. The sculptor cut the older imperial fashion into a shape suitable for Vespasian, yet the operation stopped before every Neronian feature was removed. A receding lower lip associated with the earlier portrait still survives. 2 rulers remain inside one object. Vespasian occupies the face presented to the viewer and the identity printed on the museum label. Nero survives in the mouth, the shortened hair, and the physical boundary where one imperial image was cut into another. The head had already acquired another false unity by the time it entered the museum. When Cleveland purchased it in 1929, it was attached to a toegate body that did not originally belong to it. The assembled statue appeared more complete than the ancient object really was. In 1973, the unrelated head and body were separated. The modern assembly did not create the ancient recarving, but it added another stage to an object repeatedly reorganized by history. Nero ruled from 54 to 68 CE. After his overthrow and death, his public image became politically dangerous. Some portraits were destroyed, removed, mutilated, hidden, or replaced. Others were taken into workshops and made to represent acceptable rulers. Historians often describe such attacks on imperial memory with the modern term damnatio memoriae. But Roman memory sanctions did not operate through one uniform legal procedure. They varied by reign, region, institution, and object. There was no single moment when every image of Nero changed, and no universal command that produced identical results across the empire. Instead, individual monuments were handled locally. Names were removed. Faces were cut down. Hair was shortened. Marble surfaces were adjusted to the needs of a new regime. The Cleveland head preserves that operation almost like a diagram. The approved emperor faces forward. The condemned emperor remains in the parts the transformation did not fully erase. The original setting is unknown. The head may have stood in a niche, against a wall or above eye level, where the back was difficult to see. In that position, the alteration may have been considered complete. But the stone was not replaced. It was instructed to become someone else, and Cleveland is only the beginning. Roman imperial portraits were not neutral likenesses. They occupied civic buildings, monuments, sanctuaries, and other spaces where the emperor's face represented accepted authority. When the ruler changed, the political meaning of those images could change with him. The practical explanation for recarving is strong. Marble carried the cost of quarrying, transport, and skilled labor. A finished portrait was already shaped, polished, and installed. Reworking it could save resources, update a public space quickly, and demonstrate loyalty by replacing a condemned ruler with an approved successor. But a sculptor was never working with an empty block. The skull, brow, cheeks, mouth, and hair had already been organized around another person. Marble could be removed, but it could not be added back. Every new emperor had to emerge from the volume left by the old one. A larger portrait in the Walters Art Museum in Baltimore makes that problem visible. Accession number 23.118 measures 70.4 centimeters. It was produced as Nero during his reign between 54 and 68 CE and recarved around 70 CE to resemble Claudius. This was not a simple update into the newest ruler. Claudius had ruled before Nero. After Nero's fall, his portrait was pushed backward into the face of an earlier emperor whose authority could again be politically useful. The front was heavily reworked. The cheeks, jaw, and area around the mouth were cut into the deeper grooves associated with the older Claudius. Nero's younger face was forced toward the appearance of an aging predecessor. But the back tells a different story. Nero's deeply cut locks remain untouched. From the front, the marble speaks in the visual language of Claudius. From behind, the hairstyle still belongs to Nero. The transformation is not distributed evenly across the object. It follows the probable lines of visibility. That may be entirely practical. If the statue stood against architecture or above an audience, the rear locks may never have mattered. Removing them could also have required reducing the skull or weakening the head. Additional labor would have produced little political benefit if no one could see the result. Yet the physical outcome is still remarkable. The sculpture did not become a completely new object. It became a controlled surface. Its identity depended on where the viewer stood. A second Walters portrait shows what happened when the old face left too little stone for the new one. Accession number 23.119 is a 66-centimeter 1st century head carved from Thasian marble. It is now identified as Vespasian. The museum states that its unusual flatness and surviving hairstyle suggest that it began as Nero, before being recarved into the Flavian emperor. The qualification matters. Unlike the confirmed Nero to Claudius portrait, this earlier identity is presented as a probability rather than a certainty. But the technical evidence is striking. To produce Vespasian from Nero, the sculptor had to remove the earlier features. The more deeply the old face was cut away, the less depth remained for the new one. The compressed appearance may be the physical cost of political replacement. The front had to become recognizable as Vespasian, even when the marble no longer offered enough volume for a fully natural face. The surviving hairstyle still points toward the portrait underneath. These objects reveal that recarving was not a repair. It was a negotiation with an existing emperor. A cheek could be lowered. A mouth could be pushed back. Hair could be shortened. A youthful face could be aged. But the previous portrait always imposed a boundary on what the successor could become. The condemned image became the material foundation of the approved image. That is why the unfinished parts matter. They are not merely flaws in a later portrait. They record the limits of the transformation itself. Erasure usually suggests absence, a broken inscription, an empty pedestal, a missing statue, a name struck out until only a gap remains. Recarving produced a different kind of erasure. The object stayed. Its weight stayed. Its marble stayed. Its place in a building or public space may have stayed. Only the identity recognized by society changed. The monument survived the person it once represented, while viewers were asked to accept a new face in the same stone. That does not mean Roman audiences were deceived. The transformation may have been obvious. A recarved portrait could itself demonstrate submission. The old ruler had not merely been removed, but made to serve the successor. This possibility becomes more important when the surviving cases are considered as a group. A study published in the Journal of Roman Archaeology assembled a dataset of 189 recarved male imperial portraits from the first 3 centuries of Roman rule, and compared them with a wider body of 2,028 identified imperial portraits. The 189 examples do not belong to one emperor or one political crisis. They record repeated dynastic changes across generations. Nero is the most frequent original ruler beneath a later face. Caligula appears next, followed by Domitian. Portraits of Caligula were transformed into Claudius, Augustus, or Tiberius. Nero became Vespasian. Claudius, Augustus, Titus, or Domitian. Domitian became Nerva or Trajan. A marble face could move forward into a successor. It could also move backward into an earlier emperor whose memory had become useful again. This was not a single reset of Roman civilization. It was a sequence of documented political transitions, each placing new demands on the images already standing in public space. But across centuries, the sequence produces a consistent rhythm. The ruler changes, the stone remains, the name changes, the face is cut, the public setting continues. The practice extended far beyond Rome. Recarved portraits survive from Italy, Iberia, Greece, Egypt, Gaul, the Danube-Balkan region, Asia Minor, and North Africa. The pattern was not uniform. Rome appears to have reacted rapidly to political change. Asia Minor often preferred new sculpture, while the small surviving North African group tends to show unusually thorough transformations. One of the strongest North African examples is an over-life-sized marble head of Vespasian in the British Museum. Accession number 1850. 304-35. Excavated at Carthage in modern Tunisia, it is dated to approximately 70 to 80 CE. The museum describes it as perhaps recarved from Nero. Again, the uncertainty is part of the evidence. This is not a confirmed transformation presented as fact, but a probable one supported by its physical condition and comparison with other portraits. A recent academic survey classified the Carthage head as a highly thorough transformation because the sculptor worked on every available side. Unlike the Walters Nero recarved as Claudius, where the older locks remain at the back, this portrait was not simply updated on the front. The cutting continued around the entire head, yet Nero may still survive in the surface. Grooves beneath the new hairline preserve evidence of locks that were removed. The old hairstyle is gone, but the act of removing it remains visible. This is a different form of survival. At Cleveland, Nero persists in a cut line and an incompletely altered lower lip. In Walter's accession, 23.118, his locks remain untouched behind Claudius. In Walter's accession, 23.119, the hairstyle and flattened face suggest an earlier Neronian portrait. At Carthage, the transformation may have been far more complete, but the predecessor survives as a technical disturbance beneath the new hairline. Every degree of recarving produced a different relationship between past and present. Sometimes the old ruler remained recognizable from another angle. Sometimes only proportions or tool marks revealed the earlier face. In the most thorough cases, the former identity survived as a scar rather than a likeness. The dataset attempted to measure that variation. Of the 162 portraits for which the extent of alteration could be assessed, 52% belonged to what the researchers called Level 2. In these portraits, sculptors substantially reworked the front and other visible surfaces while leaving less visible areas partly or completely untouched. More than half of the assessable transformations followed the logic seen in Cleveland and Baltimore. The public face changed. The surfaces outside the expected view changed less. That statistic turns an unusual object into a larger pattern. The Level 2 pattern does not require a symbolic explanation. Placement alone may account for much of it. A freestanding statue visible from every side demanded more work than a portrait pressed into a niche. A head placed above eye level did not require the same finishing as one meant to be approached closely. Deeply cut hair could be left at the back if the architecture concealed it. A mouth or jaw could remain imperfect if the distance made the discrepancy unreadable. The original settings of most surviving heads are unknown, and that absence limits every interpretation. A modern museum visitor can circle the object under even lighting. An ancient viewer may have seen it from one direction, through shadow, above a pedestal, or behind a barrier. The museum exposes surfaces the monument may have hidden. That difference explains why an unfinished back may look more mysterious now than it did in antiquity. But display logic does not make the transformations politically neutral. A portrait already occupied space. It had been approached, viewed, and understood as imperial presence. Recarving could redirect the authority attached to that monument without rebuilding the architecture around it. The pedestal stayed. The surrounding building stayed. The marble stayed. The state changed the person the object was permitted to represent. A later case in the J. Paul Getty Museum shows that this technique was not limited to the aftermath of Nero. Accession number 83.AA.43 is a marble portrait of Nerva, dated to 96 to 98 CE and measuring approximately 33 centimeters high. The museum identifies it as a portrait of Nerva recarved from Domitian after Domitian's assassination in 96 CO. The sequence repeats with different names. Domitian falls. His public image becomes vulnerable. His face is converted into Nerva. By the end of the 1st century, recarving was not an improvised response to one exceptional crisis. It remained one option within a larger system of memory sanctions. Some condemned portraits were destroyed or mutilated. Some were removed, hidden, or replaced with newly produced sculpture. Others were made politically useful again. The choice depended on marble supply, workshop skill, political urgency, the original head, and its display. That is why the regional variation matters. Rome could respond quickly when loyalty shifted at the center. Asia Minor often appears to have favored new production. The surviving North African examples are fewer, but their alterations tend to be more complete. Carthage and Baltimore provide the clearest contrast. The probable Nero to Vespasian head from Carthage was worked on every available side. The confirmed Nero to Claudius head in Baltimore received a heavily altered face while the older locks remained at the back. One portrait conceals almost everything except the grooves created by removal. The other leaves an entire section of the previous hairstyle untouched. The difference may reflect display, workshop practice, or available stone. It may also have changed the object's message. A completely disguised predecessor simply produced a portrait of the new emperor. A detectable predecessor could turn the transformation itself into part of the political message. The old image had been cut down, subordinated, and forced to carry the successor. Scholars have proposed that some surviving traces may have allowed viewers to compare the condemned ruler with the accepted one, but the lost display contexts prevent that explanation from being applied to every head. The same chisel mark can record economy, haste, technical limitation, or deliberate memory theater. The stone preserves the operation. It does not preserve the workshop instructions. What it does preserve is continuity through replacement. The same physical head could pass through overthrow, assassination, and dynastic change without leaving public life. The monument remained stable while the identity inside it was redirected. Destruction announces rupture. Recarving allows the world around the statue to appear unchanged. This continuity is the most important difference between a ruined portrait and a recarved one. A broken statue declares that power has collapsed. An altered statue allows a building, pedestal, or civic space to keep functioning. The public sees order rather than an empty place. The face is new. The structure remains. That may explain why economic and political motives cannot be separated. Reusing marble saved resources, but it also preserved the authority of the monument. A successor did not need to build a new setting if the old setting could be redirected toward him. The previous ruler's image became raw material for loyalty. At Cleveland, Nero's head was reduced until it could present Vespasian. In Baltimore, Nero was aged backward into Claudius. At the Getty, Domitian became Nerva. At Carthage, a possible Nero was cut so thoroughly that only grooves beneath Vespasian's hairline may reveal the earlier portrait. These were not identical acts, but they shared one result. Political recognition changed faster than the marble itself. The strongest question is therefore not why Roman portraits were recarved. The evidence already answers that. Portraits were politically charged. Regimes changed. Marble and skilled labor had value. Communities needed to update public images. Sculptors worked within the volume left by an earlier face, and display position determined which surfaces required attention. The harder question is how visible the editing was meant to be. The level 2 statistic is central here. Among 162 assessable portraits, 52% were altered most heavily on the front and other visible surfaces, while less visible areas were left partly or completely untouched. That pattern may be entirely practical. The unusual flatness of Walter's accession 23.119 shows the danger of cutting too deeply. Once Nero's features were removed, there may not have been enough stone for a fuller Vespasian. Walter's accession 23.118 presents another limit. Removing Nero's deeply carved rear locks may have required reshaping the skull for a surface facing a wall. Cleveland follows the same economy. The face and hair became recognizable as Vespasian. The remaining lip and rear cut line may mark the point at which the work was sufficient, but practical sufficiency and political meaning could coexist. A viewer who noticed the outdated hair or the compressed features might not see a failed portrait. The visible mismatch could show that the old emperor had been conquered. His image had not disappeared. It had lost the right to remain itself. This cannot be proven for most objects because their visibility and viewing distance are lost. The cut line records the operation, not its intention. What it does reveal is the exact point where the stone changed allegiance. At Carthage, even one of the most thorough transformations left grooves beneath the new hairline. At Cleveland, a border remains between Nero's former locks and Vespasian's approved silhouette. In Baltimore, the old hairstyle occupies the back of a new imperial face. The predecessor survives at different levels as likeness, proportion, hairstyle, groove, or scar. That is why the metaphor of a reset is useful only when kept narrow. There was no global reset. These objects do not support a fabricated chronology, an advanced lost civilization, or a modern museum cover-up. The museums identify the recarvings openly, and the historical sequence is documented through style, tool marks, archaeological context, and comparative study. The reset occurred at the level of political recognition. A ruler fell. A successor was accepted. The public image was adjusted. The old identity lost official authority even when parts of it remained physically present. The marble did not forget. The institution around it changed what the marble was allowed to mean. One object in Algeria reduces this process to its most literal form. In the Skikda Museum is a bust of Caracalla that was later reassigned to Constantine by changing the imperial name on its base. The Journal of Roman Archaeology researchers classified it as the only level 0 example in their dataset. Unlike the recarved heads, the portrait's identity changed through the inscription rather than through visible alteration of the face. The distinction is essential. The Cleveland Vespasian was physically cut from Nero. Walter's accession, 23.118, was physically cut from Nero into Claudius. Walter's accession, 23.119, probably began as Nero, according to its surviving hairstyle and unusual flatness. The British Museum Vespasian from Carthage was perhaps recarved from Nero, with grooves beneath the shortened hairline supporting that interpretation. The Getty Nerva was recarved from Domitian. At Skikda, the supplied evidence points to something simpler. The face stayed. The name changed. Caracalla became Constantine through the base that instructed viewers whom the object represented. No mouth was recut. No cheeks were lowered. No hairstyle was shortened. The inscription redirected the identity of the portrait. This is the closest example to a statue being renamed after a political reset, not a hidden rewriting of antiquity, but a documented reassignment within the Roman practice of adapting imperial images to new political realities. The case exposes how identity depended on context. Pedestal, inscription, architecture, and viewer expectation all helped name the image. Change the words beneath the face, and the same marble could become someone else. Placed beside Cleveland, the Skikda bust completes a spectrum of political editing. At one end, the name changes while the face remains untouched. Then come selective transformations, a new face cut into the front while old hair survives at the back. Then deeper operations, where almost every surface is worked, and the predecessor remains only in flattened proportions or grooves beneath a new hairline. Beyond those are the images that did not survive as portraits at all, destroyed, mutilated, hidden, removed, or replaced. No single method defined Roman memory sanctions, and no single motive explains every object, but the spectrum reveals one consistent principle. Public history could be altered without removing the monument. A city did not always need to tear down a statue. It could change the face. It could change the name. It could insert a successor into the material body of a condemned ruler. The same marble-crossed dynasties, executions, and assassinations, while its recognized identity shifted around it. And now the museums reverse the conditions under which many of these portraits were meant to work. The heads are detached from their niches, pedestals, and halls. Visitors can circle them. Light reaches the rear locks. Labels identify both the accepted emperor and the earlier face beneath him. What may once have been hidden by architecture is now available for inspection. The modern museum turns the controlled surface back into a complete object. We can now walk behind the Cleveland head and see the cut line. We can examine Nero's untouched locks behind Claudius in Baltimore. We can study the compressed face and surviving hairstyle of the probable Nero to Vespasian portrait in Thasian marble. We can trace the grooves beneath the Carthage Vespasian's new hairline. We can stand before Nerva and know that Domitian supplied the stone. At Skikda, we can see how a changed inscription redirected a face without touching it. The objects preserved the sequence of alteration, but not the ancient reaction. Was the Cleveland cut line pressed against a wall? Could a Roman viewer detect Nero's surviving lower lip? Did the Walters Claudius stand where the older locks were invisible? Was the Carthage head worked on every side because every side could be seen? Did viewers at Skikda accept Constantine's name beneath Caracalla's face, or understand the mismatch as an act of reassignment? Those questions cannot be answered from the surviving marble alone, but they do not weaken the historical evidence. They define its limit. We know that imperial portraits were destroyed, mutilated, removed, hidden, renamed, and recarved. We know that 189 altered male portraits survive in the dataset, that Nero appears most often beneath another emperor, and that 52% of the assessable examples were transformed most heavily on the surfaces expected to be visible. We know that workshops adapted their methods to the available stone. Deep hair restricted what could be removed. A youthful face could be aged only by cutting into it. A successor could emerge only from the material left by the condemned ruler. We also know that recarving preserved more than marble. It preserved the monument's place, authority, and usefulness. A public space could continue to display imperial order even after the emperor it once honored had become politically unacceptable. The practice, therefore, sits between destruction and continuity. The old ruler was denied recognition, but the object that carried him survived. His image could be subordinated, renamed, or physically absorbed into the face of a successor. That is why these portraits are more than likenesses. They are records of pressure. They show what happens when power changes faster than monuments can be rebuilt. They show that memory can be attacked without being completely removed. and they show that an erased face may continue to control the shape of the face carved over it. The mainstream explanation remains convincing. Marble was reused. Workshops saved time and labor. Political loyalty required updated images. Sculptors worked within technical limits and altered the surfaces that mattered most to the final display. Nothing in the evidence requires a hidden civilization or a secret modern reconstruction of Roman history. But the practical explanation does not make the objects simple. A recarved portrait is both a new image and the damaged survival of an older one. It announces the successor while carrying the physical limits of the condemned ruler beneath him. At Cleveland, Vespasian's face exists only because Nero's was cut down. The new emperor inherits the old emperor's marble, proportions, and mistakes. The cut line across the back separates two hairstyles, two reigns, and two permitted identities. It also joins them. Without Nero's portrait, this Vespasian could not exist in this stone. So, what are we looking at when we stand before accession number 19299.998? A portrait of Vespasian, a damaged portrait of Nero, a practical workshop solution, a public declaration that one emperor had replaced another. The object contains all four histories at once. The front gives us the ruler Rome chose to recognize. The mouth, hair, and cut line preserve the ruler the new image could never completely escape. The past was not removed. It was pushed backward into the marble. Sometimes it survived in a lip, sometimes in a hairstyle, sometimes in grooves left by the chisel, and sometimes the face did not change at all. Only the name beneath it did. The successor did not replace the condemned ruler completely. He inherited his stone, and beneath the approved face, the former emperor remains, no longer recognized, no longer named, but never entirely gone.